And ladies and gentlemen, may I also express our thanks and gratitude to you for coming this morning for the unveiling of what is, I think, an unprecedented collaboration between pharmaceutical companies, between research universities, neglected drug researchers, and multilateral organizations. Let me introduce those on the podium, if I may, at the outset. And I will go in the order of speaking, if I may. So at my far right, as you look at me on the left, is Mr. Don Joseph, who is the Chief Operating Officer of BioVentures for Global Health. And in one moment, I'm going to hand the floor to Don. Our second speaker will be David Brennan, who is immediately on my right here. David is the CEO of AstraZeneca. And then our third speaker, and David will speak about the industry perspective. Our third speaker is His Excellency Ambassador Martin Lumbanga, who is on my left here immediately, and who is the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Tanzania here to the UN and international organizations in Geneva. Our fourth speaker then will be Mr. Ali Danse, who is seated two away from me on my right. Mr. Ali Danse is the President of the South African Medical Research Council. And then our final speaker, before we hand over to you for questions, is His Excellency Ambassador Tom Mboya Okeyo, who is the permanent representative of Kenya to the United Nations and other international organizations here in Geneva. Ladies and gentlemen, let me state in one word, or one phrase rather, the mission of WIPO research. Its mission is to accelerate the discovery and the product development, to accelerate the discovery and product development of medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics for new solutions, or to develop new solutions for those suffering from neglected tropical diseases, tuberculosis, or malaria, through the sharing of intellectual property and other information on an innovation platform. In order to set the stage, let me now introduce Mr. Don Joseph, as I said, the COO of BioVentures for Global Health. Don, you have the floor.
Thank you. Let me take just a moment to set the stage for our announcement today. Neglected tropical diseases impair the lives of more than 1 billion people worldwide. These diseases cause immense but silent suffering and often death, though they remain hidden in impoverished regions and remote communities in the developing world. In fact, while people in the developing world bear a vast disproportion of the global burden of disease, the impact of neglected diseases affects us all. Increasingly, we are living in an interconnected global community. The realities of travel, economic development, and closer integration are drawing the world together more closely every day. The reality is that we need better treatments for neglected tropical diseases now. Today, we announce an important step in that direction. Wipo Research is an unprecedented research and development collaboration that brings the horsepower typically expended on developed world diseases to the neglected tropical diseases of the developing world. In Wipo Research, 8 major pharmaceutical companies are leading an impressive charge with a number of leading research institutions to speed the creation of new drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics to treat or cure these neglected tropical diseases along with malaria and tuberculosis. You may be wondering how Wipo Research can be used to accomplish this goal. By providing a searchable public database of available assets, resources, expertise, and knowledge, we believe that Wipo Research will facilitate new partnerships with organizations that conduct research on treatments for neglected tropical diseases, both in the developed world and the developing world as well. Let me give you an example. Consider a researcher in Tanzania. He's working to find a new drug for tuberculosis, but has hit a roadblock. Drug development involves a great deal of trial and error, risk, and time. With Wipo research, this researcher in Tanzania can connect with a scientist at a pharmaceutical company to get the benefit not only of additional resources, but also that company's know-how about which experiments they've tried and which have succeeded or have failed. This can significantly reduce some of the error in trial and error and lead to neglected disease research, the eureka moment, more quickly and effectively than might otherwise have been possible. Let me take just one more moment to explain how it works. Information about the assets, resources, knowledge, and expertise provided by contributing organizations can be found in the Wipo Research Database at www.wiporesearch.org. Once a neglected disease researcher has searched the database to find information that is relevant and useful to him or her, that researcher sends a request to the Partnership Hub. After receiving this request, my organization, BioVentures for Global Health, answers questions from neglected disease researchers and connects them to one or more of the pharmaceutical companies, research institutions and universities, or government organizations that have all provided resources or expertise to help move the neglected disease research project forward. From these connections, new neglected disease partnerships will be created. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. Just before handing over to David Brennan, let me just say one other word, if I may, about what's different here. So Don has set the stage, he's described the problem that we're trying to address, and he's said how we are trying to address it. But in this way of how we are trying to address it, how is what we are doing here different from what's gone before? And I would like to suggest three principal ways in which we differ from what may have gone before. First, this is a very broadly based coalition. So if you look at the axes of division in the world, if you like, we have developed and developing involved here, as you can see from the podium, but as you can also see from the materials, the number of research institutes from emerging countries and other parts of the developing world that are involved, together with leading edge pharmaceutical companies. It's also broadly based in the sense that it involves the private sector and the public sector, and is broadly based in terms of geography around the world. A second reason I think why it's different is that it does not cover just patents. It covers a broad range of information and materials that are useful for innovation. So the information platform will cover compounds, compound libraries, unpublished scientific results, regulatory dossiers, screening and platform technologies, and know-how. And very importantly, a number of the partners have indicated that they will be prepared to host researchers in their facilities in order to support work on neglected tropical diseases, and that is an extremely important step in the transfer of technology process. And thirdly, I think, as Don has said, let me say connections. So the Partnership Hub, which will be led by our partners, BioVentures for Global Health, and who will guide researchers through the available materials. This is terribly important because we all know that innovation comes from not from a single person operating in isolation, but from the combination of forces and the connections that are established, and this Partnership Hub will be extremely important in this regard. So now it's my great pleasure to turn to David Brennan, who, as I said, is the CEO of AstraZeneca. He is the president also of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Associations, and he is going to talk about the commitment of industry to WIPO research. David.
Well, thank you, Francis, and good morning to all of you. I think, as you just heard from Francis, the innovative industry really does have a significant role to play in addressing unmet medical needs, and to try to increase the access to proprietary information that will help advance the research that Francis just spoke about. I think that the Wipo research program has the potential to have a very real impact on global health, which is why we're proud at AstraZeneca to make all of our patents available to this important initiative and to promote the research and development for treatments of neglected tropical diseases for anywhere in the world. We have, we're delighted to say so far we have 8 IFPMA member companies who have agreed to participate in this initiative, working with the initial contributors that Francis mentioned a moment ago. I think collectively sharing the IP that we have along with the other assets that were mentioned, the resources and the expertise, we hope that the contributions that we make will lead to new partnerships and new opportunities for researchers to speed the discovery and the development of solutions for neglected tropical diseases. Don spoke about the scale of the problem. You know, at least 1 billion people in the world, roughly a sixth, maybe now a seventh of the world's population suffer from neglected tropical diseases, and we should not underestimate the real toll that these diseases have on individuals and their families and on society and the economics of the countries that they strike. This Wipo research is an unprecedented collaboration. As Don said, it is different. There is private sector and there's public sector partners who have come together and traditionally have not worked together on this type of initiative. I think it shows that intellectual property, and in particular patent rights, which are always talked about, do not have to be a barrier to access to healthcare. I think we're trying to provide a groundbreaking way to help to stimulate the research and development in these areas that are important to the public sector and to the private sector. You know, our company at AstraZeneca, we're passionate about innovation. We believe that it drives progress in society, and we believe that the industry's research and development has played a key role in helping to improve the health of people throughout the world. And R&D, from our perspective and from the research-based industry's perspective, is fundamentally underpinned by intellectual property, is one of the 2 basic elements of the business model that we use. And I think the path to developing new medicines is a long one, it's a complex one, it's a very expensive one, and we need to have some protection to try to provide a return on the investments that we make as we develop drugs. But I think the patents that we have available and the things that have been done so far have the have the real opportunity to have a broader benefit to wider society. And I think that, through Wipo research, IFPMA and other member companies, as well as organizations that join, can really have a very effective way of putting the commitment that I just talked about into practice and trying to leverage the innovation that I mentioned to advance medical progress even further. I mentioned, that we are very committed, so we will make all of the patents that are owned by AstraZeneca, including the patents by MedImmune, available for neglected tropical diseases research and development. We will also lend our technology, our skills, and our experience to try to better inform how the research and development around these diseases can be advanced. As Francis said, we've offered to host researchers in our laboratories for them to see the kind of work that we've done and what, as Don said, has worked and what hasn't worked, so that we can advance things together. And I think the partnership, whether it's companies, governments, NGOs, we're very advanced in our commitment to tuberculosis in Bangalore, where we spend tens of millions of dollars in research to try to come up with solutions that, for a disease that we all know has a devastating effect. So I'm excited about the launch of this event today, about the new model that has been put forward and the reason that we believe it can work. And over the coming months, I hope that the benefits of the venture itself will demonstrate the value that it has the promise to create. I think it's a great example of the commitment that we make to delivering value through innovation, to trying to find solutions through collaboration, which I think is really, really important, and to drive our success responsibly. Our goal is always to try to improve health for patients and to try to bring the benefits of that health improvement to our stakeholders, to our business, and to society. And I think, Francis, that Wipo Research is going to help us as a company as well as an industry in meeting that goal. So thank you for stepping in and taking the initiative.
Thank you very much, David. And may I underline the gesture that is being made by AstraZeneca in making available, as David has said, all its patents for licensing under this platform. This is, I think, a major gesture. It's now my great pleasure to turn to Ambassador Lumbango. Martin will speak in particular about the perspective of least developed countries.
Thank you, Francis. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. In my brief statement, I would like to say the following. First, to start with emphasizing that Wipo Research has the important role of ensuring that intellectual property has got an important role to play in terms of how it can be used to deal with the challenges of the neglected tropical diseases, or which henceforth I'll just refer to as NTDs, but also malaria and tuberculosis. Tanzania welcomes the formation of the consortium, which is intended to make available qualified researchers and the poorest countries to develop solutions to NTDs, malaria, and TB. Thirdly, we also thank very sincerely all those who have accepted to partner in the Wipo research program. I'd like to share with colleagues this morning that as far as NTDs, malaria, and TB are concerned, what is happening is they have lacked the global and even national attention, partly because of the lack of resources on the part of the developing countries, but also maybe due to lack of commitment in the past, and thirdly, due to lack of priority being given to these diseases by the developed economies, because after all, most of these diseases we're referring to here are not prevalent in their own countries. But because of movement of people from developing to developed countries and vice versa, we believe it is very important that such cooperation as Wipo Research is intended to undertake is going to be of great significance to all in the international community. I'd also like to share with colleagues here that Tanzania, as a least developed country, is one of the countries where NTDs are endemic. Not only NTDs, but also malaria and tuberculosis. We have high incidences of schistosomiasis, lymphatic filariasis, onchocerciasis, trachoma, sleeping sickness, and soil-transmitted helminths. These, as I say, are prevalent, and what happens is, in the majority of cases, you find there are multiple NTDs affecting one patient at the same time. And what this means is this involves the high risk of co-infection to other diseases, maybe 2 or 3, even more in some cases. And of course, this in turn leads to low productivity of the individuals concerned. Of course, it leads to poverty, and certainly it lacks the necessary creation of wealth. So this is a kind of a vicious cycle where these people are in perpetual poverty, which has to be dealt with. There is therefore a need for long-term commitment, as I said, on the part of governments, but also on the part of the international community, including the pharmaceuticals and others, to work together to strengthen surveillance, prevention, diagnosis, and control of NTDs, malaria, and tuberculosis. This, of course, also goes hand in glove with the right policies in terms of budgetary provisions by the governments concerned, but also clear policies which will be dealing with such problems. It's also important for me to emphasize that as for the role of the pharmaceutical industry, it is important that they continue supporting us by providing these various high-quality drugs and medicines, which would be inexpensive and therefore easily accessible in order to ensure that this is made possible. So by and large, I would like to emphasize that Wipo research has got a very high potential to help the suffering poor by working together in partnership with the poor themselves, by assisting the researchers in the poor countries to work in their own laboratories at cheaper costs, but also to carry out field researches within the developing countries themselves, and by so doing ensure that the medicines are developed that can effectively deal with NTDs, malaria, and tuberculosis. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's now my pleasure to turn to Mr. Ali Danse, who is, as I said, the President of the Medical Research Council of South Africa, and who's going to speak in particular about how Wipo research can speed R&D, research and development, and lead to new partnerships.
I represent South African Medical Research Council, which is the science council that falls under the ambit of the Department of Health in South Africa. So certainly, indirectly, I represent a mix of a developing country and a least developed country, because it is important to understand that descriptors, unless they're disaggregated, might hide the reality of what one is faced with. His Excellency the Ambassador of Tanzania mentioned about NTDs and malaria and tuberculosis. South Africa specifically does not have so many of what our rest of the continent is faced with, but certainly we are unfortunate log leaders as far as tuberculosis and HIV and AIDS is concerned. So representing the South African Medical Research Council and faced with an invitation from the Director General, Mr. Francis Gurry, there was absolutely no hesitation on my part and on the part of the organization to respond in a positive way to the invitation to join Wipo research in the fight against neglected tropical diseases. I also feel it is important that this is a stepping stone to setting a prototype and model for addressing other situations and other diseases also. I believe that this press conference and the meeting today, the launch, is part of the process, and some colleagues have mentioned that it was the conception and gestation period and the birth being today. And on a personal note, I'm a pediatrician and child health specialist. I think it is important that one nurtures and looks after the baby or the babies going forward. And I'm extremely positive that with the support, as exemplified by David and his company, and they need to be applauded to publicly have made their patent pool available to researchers, and especially in the developing world. The mission of the MRC is quite clear. It is building a healthy nation through research and innovation. However, that vision, a realization thereof, is not a simple task. R&D for new drugs, vaccines, and diagnostic is also a risky business. And that brings to mind, what is the risk appetite of the industry, high academic institutions, and so forth. So we're really talking about an informed choice and going forward. We know that, and I'm not going to go into detail, that it costs a lot, billions at times, to develop new drugs, and what one puts in, or the industry and others puts in, is realized in only a few drugs eventually. The difficulties inherent in creating the new drug, vaccine, or diagnostic, and I also feel processes, because we're not just talking about products in the context of an actual medicine, but it is also important to, especially in a developing country context, to look at public health processes in the research and health environment. I do believe that Wipo Research, as a one-stop clearinghouse of product research and development resources, assets, knowledge, and expertise, can make a significant impact on the timelines involved in creating new drugs, vaccines, and diagnostic for neglected tropical diseases, and as I've said earlier, and also form the basis for addressing other diseases too, like non-communicable diseases, for example. I want to end, Francis, by just sharing with you that at the South African Medical Research Council, we've got a national initiative called SAVI, the South African AIDS Vaccine Initiative, which is faced with trying to develop a vaccine against HIV and AIDS. I can also share with the community that a phase 1 study of a vaccine that was developed in a developing country, or third world, some people might say, was actually tested in the United States for the first time. So it was a reverse of colonial approach, I'd say. And right now, the company Novartis is partnering with SAVI to test one of their products. So I think that's one example of where one can work together. And partnerships are, the word partnership is a key word. It is important that we cannot address the huge problem and burden of disease alone, and we do need to work together. I do want to also end by saying that the terms of reference and the rules governing these partnerships are important, and I think in Wipo Research we will be looking at those going forward, and one doesn't have the answers immediately, but I am extremely pleased on behalf of the South African Medical Research Council to support your initiative. Thanks a lot, Francis.
So our final speaker is an expert both in health and diplomacy. So it's a great pleasure to introduce again Ambassador Tom Mboya-Okeyo. Tom, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Francis, and Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I feel really privileged to share this platform with you on this important day when you are launching a very important initiative for the 1 billion neglected people. It's not just neglected diseases. You have got 1 billion men, women, and children in developing countries who have got no access to medicines for some of the diseases which are really debilitating, diseases which are really killing. They kill in a slow but painful manner, disfigure, but because those diseases are affecting poor people who do not have the capacity they don't have the money to buy medicines, so they've been neglected. So they're there all over the world in developing countries, suffering day and night for years and years. And so this initiative, Francis, you may not realize how important it is for this 1 billion people, but I think I speak for them because I've, in my life before, suffered from hookworm when I was young and malaria, so I know what these neglected diseases can do. They can be very painful and extremely dangerous, so I know what it means. And therefore, this initiative by Wipo, bringing together a coalition to provide access to knowledge which the researchers can use to be able to develop new medicines to address these neglected diseases is something very, very, very important. And I just want to emphasize that Kenya and Brazil, in the year 2006, we did sponsor a resolution in the World Health Assembly on public health, innovation, and intellectual property to try and address this particular issue. After 2 years of debate, we eventually had the global strategy on public health, innovation, and intellectual property. And one of the key elements of that resolution, which is called WHA 61.21, is to have close cooperation among the multilateral agencies, particularly Wipo, WHO, WTO, and other key stakeholders like the pharmaceutical companies and research institutions who are involved with development of medicines. So this collaboration, this coalition is so important because we did realize, even as when the health ministers from 193 countries met, that unless you bring these institutions together so that the secrets which they have in developing medicines are made accessible to researchers from developing countries so that these diseases which are neglected, we can have medicines for them, nothing will work. And therefore, this to me is very important. Today, the launch of the Wipo research and the fact that you have got the CEO and leaders from the pharmaceutical industry here with you, this is a true sign of a partnership and seriousness in the way that this matter is being approached. And I just hope that other companies not represented in this room who are sitting there and listening can join in and be part and parcel of this coalition. In my life over the last 2 years, I did chair a coalition of all these scientists, the African medical research scientists from all the institutions from the African countries. And we have formed, they formed this, the ANDI, which, as we meet today, is meeting in Addis Ababa, is hosted by the UNECA and WHO. The board is meeting in Addis Ababa today, chaired by South African Minister for, co-chaired by the South African Minister for Science and Technology and Kenya's Minister for Public Health and Sanitation, bringing together all the scientists from Africa who lead research institutions and even scientists who are in the diaspora working with Novartis and other companies to think around this particular issue, how we can make medicines for, to address the neglected diseases. So I believe what we are doing today is really what they've been asking for the last 2 years. They've been asking me, how can we bring Wipo and the pharmaceutical industry from the north, from developed countries, to work with us so that we can develop some medicines for this problem. We have some ideas, but we don't have the technology. And therefore, I just want to emphasize once again that this is very important. And I believe that this coalition will live on, will be supported, because in doing so, you'll be addressing a fundamental problem which is affecting 1 billion people all over the world. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
I would like to know, to really understand, does it mean that the patterns will be free access for all those countries who want to have?
Well, there is in your dossier a thing called guiding principles, which sets out the terms and conditions, if you like, on which all the participants are coming together. And if I can simplify, and I emphasize it's simplifying, basically licenses will be available free of charge for least developed countries, and the charges will be, and for the other developing countries, the licenses will be individually negotiated with a commitment on the part of the pharmaceutical companies and other providers to be moderate or modest, if you like, in their requests. David?
While sometimes it's not evident, some of the patents that companies like ours have prior relationships where there may be royalties due on the use of that patent. And so I think, as Francis said, the spirit with which we would go into these is to make the agreements as least burdensome as possible. I would just caution that sometimes we have an obligation ourselves because we gained access to some part of the intellectual property through others to pay them too. So it's not quite as straightforward as we might like it to be, but I think the intent is very clear.
John Halpern, Associated Press. My question was quite similar. How a company like AstraZeneca would balance these sort of altruistic aims with, you know, the requirements of satisfying shareholders when you've got a patent that expires, and then you face competition on exactly what level of access, not only through licensing, but through the database. I guess researchers who agree in writing prior to these conditions would have access to this information, and what, if anything, would not be available? If you say you're putting all of your patented information on the website, is that correct? And potentially researchers and others could have access to all of this?
So let me just start with the last part of your question by saying, yes, we are making available all of our patents, as well as all of the knowledge associated with those patents that we can provide to people who have an interest in pursuing that. We've also made clear that we are willing to host researchers from countries like those of our friends here who want to come to our laboratories in Bangalore or in Boston or in England or I guess as the three main areas where we do research with these patents, to share the research that we've done, as Don said earlier, so that some of the things that have been learned by trial and error can be better understood by people who want to further the research. I would defer to Don in a minute maybe to talk a little bit about the database and how it would operate and how people would query it. I'm not familiar with that. What I would say is that the I believe that the industry has to have a balance between the commitment that we make to trying to bring drugs through to meet unmet medical need and the need to bring drugs through for neglected tropical diseases, as an example, where there might not be as much of a commercial opportunity, but the cost associated with doing it will be less as well. So if I look at our branded research-based operating model, the cost of discovering and developing a drug and getting it to market is probably between $2 and $3 billion over the course of about 12 years. I don't envision that the work that comes out of these initiatives is going to have that same kind of time frame or price tag. I think through collaboration and through sharing, things will be able to move more quickly, less expensively, to try to address these things. So yes, there's a balance. We always have to balance with our shareholders. They recognize that we have expertise. Without the research industry's expertise, finding solutions to some of these problems is going to be much more challenging and difficult. And so we think we have a role to play. And we see that as a collective role, which is why you see we already have 8 companies that have decided to join, and my expectation is we'll have more in a relatively short period of time.
From a process point of view, the way that researchers and others who are interested will obtain information about the resources and assets available is through the website and the database that Wipo has created at www.wiporesearch.org. So those assets are, there's a wide variety of assets listed there of different types, different disease relevance, different technologies. Some are screening data from previous tests conducted. Some are technology platforms, in addition to the patents being made available by AZ. For example, Alnylam, a biotechnology company, is making its entire patent estate available for its platform technology. That information will continue to grow and be enriched. Not only the future contributors, but the current contributors are in a continual process of reviewing their own asset list to make other contributions available, and we look forward to growing this list over time. But the vehicle, the method for obtaining access is this very simple database process with a search mechanism which is found at the website that ideally will then lead to questions to us, BioVentures for Global Health, to address the needs of the researchers and match them up with the capabilities and resources of the companies, the research institutions, the universities, and other entities that have made resources available. I hope that helps.
You say that this is to treat neglected tropical diseases, but you only mentioned 2, malaria and tuberculosis, and I'm wondering how does this affect, or is there a precedent for it affecting in the future the diseases such as Ambassador Lumbanga mentioned, and for sure HIV/AIDS, as Dr. DeHansey mentioned? And doesn't this set a precedent even for the future pandemic diseases that would kill potentially as many people as these two diseases are killing?
Let me start with that as a non-scientist, non-physician, and others can correct me. But the scope of Wipo research pertains to the list of neglected tropical diseases published by the WHO, the World Health Organization, along with malaria and tuberculosis. So there's a fixed number of diseases, and again, those are spoken to in your kit. They're an attachment to the guiding principles. So it's a particular specific list, and along with the other two, malaria and tuberculosis. HIV/AIDS is not considered to be a neglected disease by the World Health Organization, and therefore is not at this time contained within the list of, strictly speaking, the neglected tropical diseases, although obviously co-infection is an issue and can be considered alongside tuberculosis and other diseases that are on the list.
And the potential for future diseases becoming neglected diseases, does this set a precedent for that?
I think that's always a discussion that could be had. I think the intent was to start with a fixed, precise list that would be well understood and well characterized by the global health community, along with the obvious needs that continue in malaria and tuberculosis. It would be up to the governance mechanisms of Wipo research to determine whether that list should be expanded in the future.
I tried to say that this initiative right now is a starting initiative, an initial impetus for the way forward. And the principles that are involved are similar, I think, across the board. Again, I'm not in the technology field, but as a physician, the principles involved are the same, and you could and can apply it to other disease entities too in the future. And a comment on the HIV, the example I gave was not to say that we need to, it was as an example of partnerships right now.
I'll start with the very first question to Mr. Gurry. Namely, you said these patents are all available. You made this classification between LDCs and DCs. And in the case of DCs, you said that there would be certain payments that they would have to incur. These are things which have to be sorted out. Actually, under the TRIPS agreement of the WTO, I mean, we take it for granted that LDCs actually have access to all, not just access to patents, but in terms of the production of these drugs in the other countries under the Doha paragraph 6 mechanism. How is it qualitatively different from that? And my question to Mr. David from the AstraZeneca, how many patents are you here talking about? And what is their current duration? Are they at the end of their patent protection? And if that be so, how is it that these partnerships will really gain anything? Generic industry can actually produce since they are at the fag end of their career. And also, I want you to ask one more question. Indian government had recently welcomed compulsory applications for compulsory licensing. And would you support this kind of initiative from the Indian government to ask generic companies to apply for compulsory licensing? I'm not talking of neglected tropical diseases, but diseases outside the neglected. And my last question is to the South African expert from the medical research. You said that the terms of the rules are in a very embryonic, incipient, early stage. Would you have some recommendations to make at this point of time, how they should be governed, given the experience of the PPP partnerships in health having failed in many developing countries?
Okay, let me start with your question about the TRIPS agreement. Look, I think your characterization of what the TRIPS agreement does is not, if I may say, entirely accurate. What the TRIPS agreement does, of course, is create certain exceptions for LDCs from product patent protection for a period of time. They create certain carve-outs for compulsory licensing in cases of emergencies. So there are, I think, what you can say, some framework rules that are established, which are favorable to LDCs. Now, what we're doing here is very different. What we're doing here is an enabling mechanism to actually take advantage of the collaboration that is being offered by a wide range of partners, from industry, from research institutions. And we are creating an information platform that will give access to information, and not just, and I tread a little bit into the territory of the answer that David will give, not just for patents, but as I said at the outset, you know, for a range of enabling information for the purpose of innovation, which intellectual property is, of course, perhaps the most valuable part. But it covers compounds, compound libraries, platform technologies were mentioned by Don earlier, know-how screening, regulatory dossiers, unpublished scientific results. So a range of information. I think this is a much more powerful mechanism for trying to enable the cross connections that we hope will generate innovation, and that's why we have intellectual property, to try to incentivize innovation.
As it relates to AstraZeneca, the number of patents, I guess there are two ways to look at the answer to that. The first one is just the number of patent families that we have available from an invention perspective, and we estimate that we have approximately 1,400 patent families that we will make available through this initiative. Those are made up then of many individual national level patents because of the requirement to file differently in different countries. And I think if you take a look at all of our filings across the countries, we have well over 25,000 patent rights either granted or pending, which will become part of this. You specifically asked at what point in the life cycle of the patent would they be contributed, and the answer is we're contributing all of our patents. So early, mid, late stage products will be made available. As it relates to the question about India and the idea of compulsory licensing, I think the industry has been supportive of what Francis just kind of summarized that came out of the TRIPS agreement, which I think in situations of emergency where things need to be done, we have agreed that that is important and we would help to facilitate it, but in less than emergency situations, I think we have to find another solution to create access and make drugs available.
You didn't answer my question on the compulsory licensing. The Indian government's initiative to ask the industry to come forward with applications for compulsory licensing.
I'm not specifically familiar with the Indian government's request to do that, so my answer is really what I said a moment ago, and that is that the industry's position on compulsory licensing has been summarized in the TRIPS agreement from 2001 or 2, whatever year, when I think we all agreed at an industry level that for certain situations, as Francis said, we support that idea, but not more broadly.
I think it boils down to, again, what I said before, the terms of reference. I did not want to use terms of engagement. That gives a connotation of confrontation. So clarity of purpose and also expectations, are they reasonable or not, and for whose benefit. So I think with those comments, what I'm saying is that to avoid any future and current disappointment, one needs to be clear what are the expectations from the parties that are involved. And Francis, with your permission, just to share with the audience that the South African Medical Research Council was asked to join initially as a provider. My official response was that, in effect, we would be both a provider in a small way, but certainly a user and definitely a supporter of this, this initiative. And lastly, the local context. For example, in South Africa, we've got the Intellectual Property Rights Act of 2008, and that provides guidance and legislative context to interactions. So it is important then to accept that we accept principles, general ones, but one then individually will have to speak to what is the local context. Thank you.
In Brazil, do you have any perspective of sharing? I know you're putting this to everyone, but you have a specific agreement, for example, with the Brazilians. And Mr. Guri, how will this play out, for example, in other debates at Wipo, development agenda, etc.? I mean, how does this fit on this issue? And maybe one of the ambassadors could say, is this a solution, or it's just part of it?
So let me start on Fiocruz, and my colleagues will help me out because we've had a discussion which is continuing, in fact. But unless I'm mistaken, Jorge Bermudez will be here this afternoon. That's correct? Yes, Christian, yeah. That is correct. So he will be here for the show that we have this afternoon. And they have signed. So they are signing on as a provider and as a user. Yes. Okay. So I know that this discussion has been continuing right up until today, actually. So that's the answer to that. Yes, look, I'd say this is entirely in the spirit of the development agenda, which is the answer I would give. It is entirely in the spirit and thrust of the development agenda, and it's, I think, a very good contribution. But let our ambassadors have a word.
In answer to our friend from Brazil, let me say the following with regard to whether this proposal is going to provide a solution. My answer is yes. This consortium arrangement would definitely provide some answers to what has been the missing link for quite some time, that neglected tropical diseases have been neglected for so long. And this is certainly going to provide some definite alternatives. But let me also add, without hesitation, that it is not going to provide the complete solution to the problem. Because in addition to what the consortium is going to do, very much will also depend on what the recipient countries themselves will have to do in terms of shaping up their policies as to how they address issues of this nature by providing increased budgets as their own initiative in this direction, because the consortium is not going to provide 100% of what is required. So, as they say, it takes two to tango. The consortium will help, but also the countries individually will have to do a lot more in this area.
Yes, it is just one step, but you need several steps to come to a conclusion, to a solution. And this particular first step is critical, because you have a situation today where even in malaria, the existing medicines are developing resistance, and you need new medicines. In trachoma, in schistosomiasis, in onchocerciasis, sleeping sickness, lymphatic, and many other problems. So even where you have some medicines for these neglected diseases, you are not sure how effective. Some of them are very, very poisonous medicines. They are really not palatable. So there's need for continuous research into coming up with new medicines to address these problems in the long term. And the avenue to do this is to have a much broader coalition so that scientists from developing countries can work together with their counterparts from developed countries who have got the technology, and they can test out some ideas, some initiatives. They can even use traditional medicine. Some of them have knowledge on some traditional medicine. They can work with their partners to explore some of these tools and be able to over a period of time, come up with some medicines to address these problems. So it is only the first step. You have a long way to go. And the fact that this first step is happening, and it's happening under an organization whose expertise and mandate is promotion of the protection of intellectual property, for which the pharmaceutical sector have a lot of confidence in Wipo. They know that Wipo will not do things which will undermine their work. The fact that this coalition has been established is very, very important for public health and for addressing this, the research and development needs for neglected tropical diseases. So I just want to emphasize that. But as Ambassador Lubanga said, the solution is much broader. You need many other partners. You need governments to put more resources in addressing the healthcare. Some of the critical problems relate to basic water and sanitation. So that needs to be, you need investments in that. Issues dealing with even infectious diseases, some of them are preventable. So there's still a need for investment in prevention, in primary health care. And so the picture is bigger. But for the research and development, particularly health needs related research which is going to lead to specific compounds which will address areas where nothing is happening today or very little. This is a major achievement. So that is the way that we understand it. And we hope that, as I said earlier, the pharmaceutical industry and other players will join hands in this coalition. And even WTO and the World Health Organization and others UNCTAD, they should become stronger partners in this movement so that we get the best out of this initiative for those 1 billion people who are neglected.
Richard Bauer from the Swiss Daily NZZ. I would be glad if you could clarify one point. Let's say all this investigation, this research will lead to a product, to a drug or a vaccine in one specific disease, in one specific problem. What will happen now when you start producing this drug? Who gets the royalties on this new vaccine or this new medicine? Is it an individual company? Is it the consortium? Is it Wipo? Could you just say, from the point of view of the industry and of the point of view of Wipo, what will happen in this concrete moment when you launch the first ever medicine against one of these X diseases?
The vehicle that is being promoted by this consortium is individual license agreements between the provider of the asset and the user of the asset. So the company, for example, on the one hand, or perhaps the university, and the neglected disease researcher on the other hand. Those license agreements will take, I'm sure, a very traditional form. Things like royalties, territories, fields of use, all traditional topics will be negotiated out and dealt with as a part of the beginning and the ultimate culmination of the relationship, which we intend to promote and stimulate. So the questions that you've raised would be answered as a part of those discussions and the documentation and the negotiations that arise from that new relationship. There is no present intent that I'm aware of for the consortium to have any economic stake or interest in that outcome, nor is there any broader sharing. In other words, the coalition itself is extremely broad, and the number of relationships we're attempting to promote is very broad. But at the end of the day, it will be individual license agreements, again, taking a pretty typical and traditional form, I think, after discussion with companies like David's and others, to achieve the particular goal for the one disease that you mentioned, the one product, and reach that particular outcome.
May I just add a word to what Don has said, and you know, I'm in total agreement with what Don has said, and so in a certain sense we can't give you a very definitive answer. But let me refer you to page 3 of the guiding principles and to paragraph 3 there as just an example of the intent. So users So let's say the South African Medical Council might be a user, or any other research institution. Users shall be allowed to retain ownership of and apply for registration of intellectual property rights generated as they deem fit, but shall be encouraged to license to third parties through WIPO research new intellectual property rights generated under an agreement. All is possible, in other words, and it will depend on the license agreement that, as Don has mentioned. But it would be entirely possible to conceive of a user generating in turn its own intellectual property as a consequence of the research that it has done using others' research. I mean, the whole idea is generating innovation. And I confirm, of course, that there's no intention on the part of the consortium to retain any economic benefit whatsoever.
If AstraZeneca is making all of its patents available, what is the percentage, or why aren't all the other companies also doing that? Along with that, what makes your company, if you are doing that and the other companies are not doing that, what makes you confident that it's a good thing to do this, and what's made the other companies perhaps decide not to do it? Were there other companies that that Wipo approached to be part of this consortium that declined to be part of this? That's the first part of the question. Second part is a bit more hard to set up, I guess, but as you all know better than anyone else here, your companies, to bring products to market, go through numerous hoops. The FDA in the United States has to approve, the Swiss equivalent has to approve, and then countries that don't have their own regulatory agencies depend on these agencies to approve, and then they take the drug. In doing that, there's mountains of research that's published ahead of time. The companies employ liaisons who then, between the major figures who conduct the clinical trials and share confidential information back and forth. But in any case, there's tons of information available, as you all know, before things come to market. So the second part of the question is, actually, in fact, this presumption that once you get together, magic things will happen, sharing all this information, but in fact, how much new information will be available to researchers that they wouldn't already have through all the the incremental steps of bringing products to market? Thank you.
It's difficult for me to postulate about why certain companies have come in to the consortium in different ways as to how much of their intellectual property they'll put in, under what circumstances, etc. Francis may want to make a comment about that. I think the second part of your question, which was why do we believe that by putting in as much as we have put in, that will lead to a good outcome. I think, my personal perspective on that, having thought about it as we developed our policy on it, was that while some of our intellectual property is not intuitively oriented toward neglected tropical diseases, it may be that some researchers will find some value in it that we would not necessarily find because we weren't looking for it. So I think our view is the more that we can make available, the more likely it is that something that we have done will contribute some part of the solution, that could be found, that ultimately, as our friend asked about the first day that we introduce the new product, that's going to be an exciting day, I must admit, and it will have come from a lot of work. So I think the more that we can make available, the more likely we are to have made a contribution. As it relates to generating new information versus old information, I'm not a scientist, but it seems to me that the process for developing this information is probably more incremental than it is revolutionary. And so I think that the information flow builds upon what has existed before it to continue to contribute more information, which ultimately I hope will contribute to some form of protection or intellectual property. But I can't, you know, it's very difficult to hypothesize, I think, on exactly how that will work. Maybe Ali or somebody wants to say something. It's not intuitive to me.
I think, again, it's got to do with context. So we're talking about least or middle income or developing countries. And I can mainly speak for my own country. Although it's one country, it's absolutely disparate between and within regions within the country, and similarly also as far as the higher academic institutions are concerned. So those well-established universities would have a march on information access and so forth. But I think we're talking about the process here within the country, for example, and the access possibly via this consortium and access to the database for those universities and researchers that do not have the facilities, for example. So I'm looking at it from the perspective of the haves and have-nots, and also a chance to provide capacity building both in the regulatory frameworks, IRB approval processes. These are things that are taken for granted in other sectors. And I do have to say we are part of Africa, and certainly our neighboring countries are at not at the level in certain areas, so we do need a lot of capacity building. Thanks.
I think it remains to be said that every company approaches their intellectual property from a unique point of view, and they have their own philosophy and their own perspective, in the same way that every company has a pre-existing commitment that they've already made in global health and have undertaken other efforts. So this is meant to build on both prior commitments in global health on the part of the companies, as well as to expand their consideration of how they approach their own particular assets and resources. As I mentioned earlier, the goal here, which I think bears on the second part of your question, is to build individual relationships. And one of the unique aspects of this new collaboration is an unprecedented level of access and reach into the actual workers who have done the hard work in the laboratories to find out what works and what doesn't work. To be able to have those discussions directly, that is definitely a new element of knowledge and access, which, at least in the broad sense, has not existed prior to today. So we're fixed on that as a new opportunity. And then finally, I just wanted to add that all of the contributor companies, I think I mentioned earlier, are in a continual process of review of what else can they make available, what else can they bring into Wipo research. So not just recruiting new providers of intellectual property and expertise, which will be ongoing, but the current contributors will also keep looking and keep adding to their contributions.
The question was directed to pharmaceuticals, and I do not represent any. But I thought I would like to also contribute by answering as to why we from the developing and especially poorer countries are urging the pharmaceutical industry to contribute more. And I believe the pharmaceuticals that have already willingly accepted to partake in this venture do appreciate the role of corporate social responsibility. That if they can provide these services, medicines, and the like on a more flexible arrangement, it will certainly help what I said earlier on with regard to increased productivity in their own countries, but also in the developing countries where they have got branches of their pharmaceutical companies operating. If this, in the same basis, if they contribute to education, that it ensures a more productive labor force. So all in all, it is certainly going to benefit all. I don't want to sound philosophical here, but I think I'm only stating the obvious, that as one global village, there is need to work cooperatively for the betterment of each and everybody. So I think these companies have realized this important role of corporate social responsibility, and we believe others will follow suit.
Dr. Robert Seberg from Sanofi Aventis.
Yes, just to answer to your question, some others company, why we have decided to join the coalition. I think it's very important. The history of Sanofi, our presence in Africa, in emerging and developing countries, We are #1 company, and I think it was impossible for us not to be in this coalition. And we have started already the process, because we signed some agreement with the NDI, with some other university. And just to give you an example about your question about when the product is on the market, we have developed with the NDI a product against malaria, a fixed-dose combination, artesunate amodiaquine. And when we signed the contract between the NDI, we have decided, okay, we make a common development. We have an expertise, we have a know-how, and we have made the development of this compound. The second point was this product is to be available for adult 3 days treatment, less than $1. We fixed the rules before. And less than 50 cents for children. And number 3, no patent. We have agreed with the NDI, no patent. And because this product is on private market with a normal price, and on public markets, the most important one is no profit, no loss, we give some royalties to the NDI only on the private market. And we sign, and it is a fact today, because the product is on the market, and we have already some result. And we have decided to go a little further on sleeping sickness. And one point about shareholder. You think, what about the shareholder, because there's no profit, no patent? I think incentive for pharma industry is not only financial one. I think image, reputation, and also our position in terms of corporate social responsibilities. We know, and Mr. Brennan, you know, that some investment, some money is coming from what they call ethical funds. And they ask us, they ask the pharmaceutical industry, are you an ethical way of working? What are you doing about access to medicine? What are you doing about intellectual properties for most neglected tropical diseases? And we have every year a report on our corporate social responsibility activity, and I think it's also important. And we have some pressure from our shareholder to say, okay, you have to work on an ethical way, you have to do something on access, you have to do something in terms of research. And I think these incentives are also very important. Thank you.
I think we need to wrap up soon. I just have Reuters and another question from AFP. No, AFP has been answered, so maybe we can wrap up with the last question. And then Ravi, 2 last questions.
I'm sure it's safe and fair to say that today the selling of the medication for tropical disease is not as profitable. But in the future, if for some reason it becomes very profitable and pharmaceutical companies face pressure from their shareholders to sell more or to pursue the sales of tropical medication for tropical diseases, is there a way for pharmaceutical companies to exit an initiative like the one launched today?
I hadn't really considered exiting since we just signed on. But I think that I think that the way I look at the decisions we make about creating access to discoveries that we have that we get to the market, whether they are for the developed world or the developing world, is to do what we can to increase the access to the medicines, because we spend so much money and take so much time and energy of our people to try to make them available. So we have 10,000 plus people that work in research and development, and the vast majority of them will never work on a drug that makes it to the market. But they come to work every day with the mindset and the intent that they're so excited about the potential opportunity that they're working on. And I think that influences the way I think, and as a company, or certainly as an executive team and a board, we think about how we price drugs to make them available. And I think the example that was just given by our friend here from Sanofi, it's a great example of trying to figure out a way to make sure that you create the most access you can, without making necessarily any money or any loss, just kind of try to make them available. And it's very difficult for me to envision that our shareholders would come to us and say, you're not making enough money on drug X or drug Y. I think they would understand that if we were making a malaria drug available in Tanzania or another, that they would recognize why we're doing that. I just don't envision the situation emerging the way you described it that would cause me to say, let's get out of it. I think we're in this for the long run and for the right reason. And ultimately through tiered pricing and other mechanisms, transfer of technology, we can figure out ways to make things available at a reasonable cost.
I take one disease on the list of most neglected tropical diseases, dengue. Tomorrow, my company, your company, another company will have a vaccine against dengue. We know now dengue, it's all around the world, developed country, developing country, and travelers. We can imagine, and it's done already for other vaccines, what we call tiered pricing. For the people living in endemic country, in the south, the price will be a no profit, no loss, or at cost price. But for the travelers, from people from France traveling in endemic country with dengue, they will pay the full price with profit. And this is the case now if you take yellow fever. If I have to go in Africa, I will pay 40 euros of vaccines, but it sells to UNICEF or to Gavi less than €1. And we can think this, establish this type of design even for most neglected tropical diseases.
I think there's something that I feel is not come out, but is very important. And this is innovation within the pharma industry. You're all aware that this is not an area that is doing very well. It's doing very poorly. And innovation is not something that is only restricted to the developed economies. I believe that this initiative has the potential to not only create new medicines, but to increase innovation in the pharmaceutical industry by bringing in all this expertise from across the globe. And so it is something that even the shareholders in the pharma industry should see the benefit, which may not be quite obvious at this particular stage. The second point is that you might actually have a new medicine for treating dengue or treating malaria, and then discover the same medicine can actually treat cancer or some other problems in the developed countries. So this is an area that there's a lot of opportunities which may not be obvious at the moment, but in the long run is likely to benefit everybody. Secondly, who says that people in developing countries will always be poor? Who says that? Who has made that decision? Nobody knew China would be a big player in the world economy today, 20 years ago. And in some of our countries, even in Africa, in the coming 50 years, you will have 2.2 billion people there, looking at the current economic and growth figures. And so it's important that these are potential markets for the future. So as these economies improve, the living standards improve, what you're investing today may actually be sold in future at profit, depending on how these matters play. So it's not that our countries will remain poor forever. No, I don't believe so. In fact, Kenya is supposed to be a middle-income country very soon. And some of the poor people will then be able to buy and actually pay for the price of these medicines. So the stakeholders, and I take this question that AP asked, that Wipo is doing some altruistic games with the stakeholders' money. I don't believe so. I think this is the wrong approach. What we are having now is bound to create more innovation in the industry, which is a major problem now, and is going not only to be for solidarity, but is something that in the long run will be beneficial for everyone. Thank you.
This collaboration and this initiative, does it mean that you are essentially waiving off data protection requirements?
I think when we decide to contribute, Francis just reminded me, yes, I think then it's the timing of regulatory dossiers and, the decision we make about contributions. So I would have to, you know, have my patent counsel advise me specifically, but yeah, I think we do. Francis?
Yeah, well, it's potentially in the scope of the information platform. And then it's up to the partners to decide how they approach this matter. So, look, I would just like to say, before you close off, Samar, two things, if I may. First, let me emphasize, again, this is the start. And we are anxious to build on this start. So it's only the commencement. We haven't answered all the questions, but we've set a very good basis for addressing the questions, I think. And the second thing is, this is a collaboration, and as you can see, and I would like to extend my thanks here to all of the partners who have contributed to this, including my own colleagues who have worked so well on this. This is a collaboration, and in order to be successful, it is going to rely on, going to need the collaboration of the pharmaceutical industry. It's going to need the collaboration of the government, research infrastructure around the world, and the universities, as well as the users and individual researchers. And I'd like to see, you know, the press in the same spirit. Give us a chance on this one, and let's see if we can make it work.